Whether it's checking up on COVID stats,
Feels all right to go?
the Black Lives Matter movement,
Black Lives Matter.
the Beirut blast,
Huge explosion in the Lebanese capital, Beirut.
or this year's tragic bushfire,
Massive fires, already among the worst in that country's history.
chances are you're consuming a fair share of news content through social media. Now, everyone is a publisher. Social media gives everyone an equal voice, giving you and your next-door neighbor the same tools as any media organization. But by providing this extensive publishing freedom, is social media a tool for journalism, or is that being drowned out by misinformation? I'm Pranjali Sehgal, an intern at the Melbourne Press Club, and today we're talking about news media literacy and the role of social media in news consumption across Australia. The way young Australians access news has changed drastically over the last few years. Social media now acts as a news provider, and that raises concerns about misinformation. I reached out to Dr. Tanya Notley, author of a recent study on how young Australians consume news, to get a better understanding on the subject.
My name is Dr. Tanya Notley. I'm a senior lecturer at Western Sydney University. I've been studying young people in media for 20 years, and I guess after the Trump 2016 election, we heard a lot of anxiety around fake news and then around misinformation. We've seen in every major event, including this current COVID-19 pandemic, a rise in misinformation, and there's been a lot of anxiety around that. This national survey of young people's news media practices is part of a much larger study of young people in news that we've been carrying out over the last 3 years in partnership with Michael Dejuani from Queensland University of Technology. So we've been looking at news and young people in many different ways. So back in 2017, I looked at what research we had on young people in news and found that there was really nothing in the Australian context. So I really wanted to fill that gap, particularly because the habits that young people form around news practices will shape what they're doing in their 20s. We can't expect them to suddenly change and have radically different news media practices as when they become adults.
Dr. Notley found an increasing amount of young Australians are now consuming news from social media like never before.
Found that 38% of children were regularly getting news from social media and 75% of teens were regularly getting news from social media. We asked them the platforms they prefer, and children preferred YouTube, Facebook, and then TikTok. And for teenagers, it was Facebook, very closely followed by Instagram and then YouTube. Instagram had a really big jump in news engagement, and that's the same for the adult surveys in Australia. So I think that's really the one to watch, and news looks very different on Instagram than it does on Facebook and Twitter. So I think that's a significant shift.
A critical issue faced by journalism across Australia today is the severe lack of public trust in media.
Only 1 in 5 have a high level of trust in news media organisations. That issue of trust is paramount. I think that if news media organisations don't deliver news that is trustworthy, that it has a flow-on effect to all the level of trust people have in news media organisations across the board. And when you look back in Australia, actually there were so many programs in the 70s and even the 80s of newsrooms being connected to classrooms. And that's all gone now. Newsrooms don't engage with schools in the same way that they used to, and I think that that's really important, and of course that's very challenging for newsrooms who now have far less resources in which to do that. But I think that a relationship with journalists and a relationship with newsrooms is probably going to make a big difference to the early formation of trust, of course, if that experience is a good experience.
Dr. Notley also believes in the need for a dedicated news media literacy course in all school curriculums across Australia.
We've realised as we've examined how news is or is not integrated into classrooms is that media literacy is something that every student should be getting as part of a national curriculum. We have a media arts national curriculum, and we're one of the few countries in the world that therefore has mandated media literacy education. But we really found that news had dropped out of media literacy, so it became much more as technology became increasingly accessible over the last 20 years. The shift has sort of moved to digital skills, and news has really fallen out of media literacy education. So we think that that's an issue that does need addressing. And so I think that news media literacy should be taught the same way as media literacy, in terms of it should cover things including media institutions, so understanding the different types of organisations that are producing, distributing news, media languages, which is about really understanding how meaning is communicated through images, sound and text. And then the new key concept that we propose is really important is media relationships, so really understanding how relationships are formed through media, and also how media is created through relationships.
Dr. Tanya is not the only one who feels a news media literacy course is much needed in Australian schools. Sam Kozlowski and Zara Seidler, founders of the social media news outlet The Daily Oz, believe high school students should be introduced to news and engaged with as young readers. Their work is notably popular on Instagram, where they have over 32,000 followers.
I, for one, don't recall ever having media literacy or sort of any political literacy really taught to me at school. And I know in hindsight how much I would have benefited from something like that and how much my friends would have benefited from something like that. If you're introduced to understanding the important players in the Australian political system or understanding the big events that shape policy at a younger age, you can then feel more comfortable, more familiar when you are faced with that really dense content later on.
I think a key part of the course would be helping high school students understand where to get the news from and what the impact of the source could be, and take them through a really simple understanding of political agendas by media organisations. We think high schools are a really great time to introduce young readers to the news. And if they're on social media anyway, what better way to provide them some value to the hours a day that they spend on social media.
Sam and Zara came up with the idea for the Daily Oz in 2017 when they recognized a gap in the market for a hard news platform that prioritized social media and young consumers.
I think that traditionally news and media products haven't necessarily been tailored towards young people, and that now that, you know, there are a number of statistics that back up the fact that young people are disengaging from traditional news. So there's been this definite, social first push that we've seen, and we've certainly tried to do ourselves, so that we're not taking digital natives out of their comfortable habitat, but we're rather providing them with bite-sized news where they are and what they need.
Bite-sized news is a really good way to minimise the discomfort for the reader when talking about complex ideas, which means that next time it's being talked about at a dinner party or with friends, they can actually join in the conversation and have that learning process as well without feeling totally isolated. Our readership is split mainly between 18 to 24 and 24 to 35-year-old brackets. We've got a little bit older and a little bit younger, but the vast chunk of the audience is between that kind of millennial age bracket.
We think that's the sweet spot. We think that that's the demographic that's been typically underserviced, so we're very happy with having that key audience.
We saw a big spike in growth with the bushfires over Christmas, New Year, and then another big spike with COVID, another big spike with Black Lives Matter, a smaller but noticeable spike with the Lebanon explosion. But COVID has provided consistent growth. There's a lot of news. We're seeing young people, especially for you guys down in Victoria, watch press conferences for the first time.
Every day.
Every single day. And that is really amazing.
Curating hard news content on The Daily, Sam and Zara favor moderating content from a truth perspective, as they have observed that news journalism on social media often fails to be accurate or verified.
With social media, anyone with a phone is a content producer and anyone can claim. And we've seen that, with Black Lives Matter, with any number of movements that have proliferated through social media. We've seen that there can just be this sharing and sharing. There's no clear origin. With basic journalistic principles, we would very much prefer to hold back and be on the back foot just to make sure that whatever is being reported is legitimate. We're not trying to break news. That's not our role.
We really are in favour of moderating content from a truth perspective, and that's done both by our audience, who will often tell us if they want us to check something, and also by other people in the media. And I think that's also part of our roles. I actually think audiences are quite good at identifying bullshit. And just as quickly as something can go viral for being right, it can go viral for being wrong. And I think ultimately the best way to counter misinformation would be to encourage as many people with the right approach to get involved and try and drown out those voices.
Also to equip readers with that critical thinking and the capacity to discern truth from misinformation.
Increasing news organizations are now focusing on social media as an essential tool to share their work. Instagram, with its tremendous visual content appeal, has gained the most popularity amongst all other platforms.
I think for anyone that's operating for journalism in the digital space, social media is paramount. Instagram, we get a lot of interactions, and I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the news that we kind of share onto Instagram. Those people that are interacting with that are actually coming over and listening to the live show or the podcast. I think that we're getting quite a lot more listeners from that platform than we are from Facebook or even Twitter. I think for any journalism group, whether it be student run or even on a massive scale, social media is where people are getting their news. And sometimes it's just that tiny little description that they put in. So you've got to be really careful what you're telling the audience in a snippet.
So the question arises, how do we safeguard ourselves and those around us from consuming the immeasurable misleading content on social media? Is it only the consumer's responsibility to be on the lookout, or are there some steps news companies can take to prevent misinformation? I reached out to Sami Shah, a journalism lecturer at the University of Melbourne and a former ABC presenter, to get his insights on the issue.
My name is Sami Shah, and I am a bunch of things. I am a writer. I've written for many newspapers and magazines around the world. I was formerly ABC Radio Melbourne's breakfast show presenter, 2 years, and prior to that I've done a lot of radio work with Radio National as well, presenting and making some documentaries for them. And these days I am currently a lecturer at the University of Melbourne teaching a change in journalism honours level course. I think that's largely down to social media and the kind of damage that's been done to the respect for news and the appreciation and understanding of news because of something like Facebook and fake news websites that exist on Facebook and have passed around all the articles and things. And we're seeing that particularly during coronavirus. You're going to get more success with a video than you will with an image. You're going to get more success with a meme than you will with an article. It's one of those things where that's how social media does. It's an immediacy thing. It's a details don't matter kind of format. How do you curate a better social media feed? It's not your job. You're a consumer. It's the regulators. It is the producers of the content. It's their job to fix that.
Sami Shah believes journalism in Australia and around the world deeply lacks credibility and needs to return to the basic principles of the trade.
They need to go back to the bare basics of journalism, of objective journalism, of well-researched journalism. Stop making one reporter do 7 stories instead of 3 stories and make them research them properly, take the time to get it right. Do the kind of journalism that people used to respect journalists for, and you will end up getting that respect again. It's hard to give them trust and credibility when they're not worthy of it.
Sami encourages young journalists to take charge and actively but ethically utilize social media by informing the masses and creating factual hard news.
What can the young people in journalism do? Infiltrate the ranks of the old, get into the press council, take over parts of that, make sure that when mistakes happen, those mistakes are corrected loudly, proudly, and boldly. So if you're going to be a journalist, understand why you want to be a journalist, what it is about journalism that you value, what it is about journalism that you want to enhance with your contributions, and stick to it.
So in this age of social media and constantly updating headlines, we need to be critical thinkers and understand that the news media landscape is changing. We need to be more aware of what we're consuming and where we're consuming it from.
One thing we know for sure is that news media has changed very significantly over the past decade, and we can expect that it will again in the next decade. And I think, we need to remember that in this media saturated world that we live in, that young people and adults will get news media in the places that they inhabit, and that's the reality. So maybe it will become more challenging to expect people to go directly to particular channels to get news. And I think we can see an increasing trend of people getting more and more news in the social media environments they spend their time in. And I think, that's a reality that's not going to change. Obviously, that's risky and problematic, and that's why I think those critical thinking skills are really important.